Patricia Copta. In 1992, a woman vanished from a quiet town north of Pittsburgh. For 7 years, her husband searched, until a court finally signed the paper that ended her story. He was wrong. She was sitting in a care home on an island more than 2,000 miles away. Patricia Copta grew up in suburban Pittsburgh and, by every account from her family, she had once been the kind of person people remembered. Her sister described her as a straight-A student who became a model and a dance instructor. She spent roughly a decade working in finance at a Pittsburgh plate glass company, then took a quieter job as an elevator operator at a local art institute. She married Bob Copta, and the couple settled in Ross Township, a calm stretch of homes outside the city. Then, in 1984, something shifted. Her behavior changed sharply. Her sister later recalled that Patricia said something about seeing an angel, and the woman her family knew began to slip away. She came to believe she was one of the chosen servants described in the Book of Revelation. She gave up dancing entirely. She started preaching on the streets of downtown Pittsburgh, a small figure on the corner that locals came to know. They gave her a name. They called her the Sparrow, for how slight she was. How does a woman that visible simply disappear? Patricia was last seen on June 20th, 1992. Her husband was used to her wandering, so the alarm came slowly. He did not file a formal report with Ross Township Police until late November of that year, more than 5 months later. He later told reporters the moment still did not make sense to him. He came home one night, and she was just gone, and nobody knew where she was. Bob Copta did not stop looking. He placed advertisements in newspapers in Puerto Rico, a strange choice that would later seem almost prophetic. He even consulted a psychic who told him his wife was dead, somewhere near water. 7 years after she vanished, he obtained a legal declaration of presumed death. As far as the law was concerned, Patricia Copta no longer existed. But here is what no one in Pennsylvania knew. In June of 1999, a woman was found wandering through a cluster of towns in northern Puerto Rico, southwest of San Juan. She was taken in by an adult care home as a person in need. She would not talk about her past. The only thing she told the staff was that she had arrived by cruise ship from Europe. No name that matched anything, no history. Just a quiet woman who had appeared out of nowhere. For years she stayed there, and slowly, as dementia took hold, fragments of her real life began to surface. Staff listened. In 2022, a social worker and an Interpol agent reached out to police back in Ross Township. What followed was a careful 9-month effort. Dental records were compared. DNA was collected from Patricia's sister and a nephew. And in early 2023, the answer came back. The woman in the Puerto Rican care home was Patricia Copta. She had been alive the entire time. The case was announced at a news conference in March of 2023. By then, more than 3 decades had passed. One of Patricia's sisters had already died, still believing Patricia was gone. Bob Copta, who never remarried, said the news brought him a strange kind of peace. He called it a sad thing, but a relief off his mind, and admitted that when a wife goes missing, the husband becomes a suspect. There were no charges. There was no crime. There was only a woman who had walked out of one life and into another, carrying an illness that erased the bridge between them. As of the most recent reporting, Patricia was still living in that same Puerto Rican nursing home in her early 80s, the quiet ending to a 31-year mystery. But Patricia left no trail by design. The next woman planned every step. Brenda Heist. A mother dropped her children at school on an ordinary winter morning. She sat on a park bench and cried. Then 3 strangers offered her a way out, and she took it, leaving an entire family behind for 11 years. Brenda Heist lived in Lititz, a small borough in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with her husband Lee and their 2 children. She worked as a bookkeeper at a local car dealership. By early 2002, her marriage was ending, and the divorce was turning bitter. Brenda had taken several days off work to look for a place of her own, somewhere she and the children could land once everything was finalized. On the morning of February 8th, 2002, Brenda followed her usual routine. She dropped the children at school. Then she drove to a nearby park and sat down. According to the account she gave investigators years later, she had just learned that her application for housing assistance had been denied. She had no plan, no home lined up, and no idea what came next. So she sat on the bench and she cried. That is when 3 strangers walked up to her, 2 men and a woman. They were heading to Florida, and on what she would later describe as a complete whim, they invited her to come along. Brenda Heist, a bookkeeper and a mother in the middle of a divorce, decided in that instant to vanish. She got up and went with them. What would it take for you to walk away from everything in a single afternoon? Her car was found 4 days later in a bus station parking lot in a neighboring county. And almost immediately, suspicion landed on her husband. Lee Heist was treated as a homicide suspect. He took a polygraph examination and passed it. It did not matter much. He lost his job anyway. He and the 2 children eventually had to move into assisted housing. The disappearance of Brenda Heist did not just remove a person. It quietly dismantled the lives of everyone she left behind. Years passed with no trace. In 2009, Lee Heist filed a petition with the court, and a Lancaster County judge declared Brenda Heist legally deceased. Lee then collected roughly $100,000 from her life insurance policy and, in time, remarried. The family had grieved, settled the paperwork, and moved forward into a life without her. So where had she actually been? The answer came on a Friday in late April of 2013. Brenda Heist walked into a sheriff's office in Key Largo in the Florida Keys and turned herself in. For 11 years, she had been living under a false name. She had drifted, working odd jobs, at one point employed as a housekeeper. A friend from those years later told CNN that Brenda had lied even to the people closest to her, claiming she was a childless widow. The mother of 2 had erased her own children from the story she told strangers. A detective from Lititz called Lee Heist to tell him. Lee, who had spent 11 years believing the worst, assumed the call was finally a notification that her remains had been found. Instead, he learned she had been alive the whole time. There were consequences now. Brenda was held in a Florida jail on charges that included giving a false name to law enforcement and a probation violation tied to a stolen driver's license. She was sentenced to a term for the probation violation and released in November of 2013, after serving roughly 5 months under a work release program. She gave a jailhouse interview in which the interviewer described her as being in complete and utter meltdown. Her family did not welcome her back. Her daughter made it publicly, painfully clear that there would be no reunion. Lee had already built a new life. Brenda eventually moved to Texas to live with her mother. By the most recent reporting, she had never reconciled with the children she left on that ordinary winter morning. Brenda Heist ran from a life that was falling apart. The next man ran from one he had carefully built. John Darwin. A father went canoeing off the English coast and never came back. His wife collected the insurance, his sons mourned him, and the world moved on. 5 years later, he walked into a London police station and said he was a missing person. John Darwin lived in Hartlepool, in the northeast of England. He was a former teacher who had become an officer with the prison service. He and his wife Anne had been married since the early 1970s and had 2 sons. On paper, the Darwins looked stable. They owned a string of rental properties. But behind that, by 2002, they were buried in debt so deep that the entire structure of their finances was close to collapse. On March 21st, 2002, John Darwin told people he was going canoeing from the beach at Seaton Carew. When he failed to turn up for a shift at the prison where he worked, a major air and sea search was launched along the coast. The next day, the wreckage of his red kayak was found. There was no body. After a period, an inquest returned an open verdict, and a death certificate was issued. That certificate was the entire point. With John declared dead, Anne was able to claim a substantial sum from life insurance policies and pensions, money that addressed the debt closing in on them. The grieving widow collected what the law said she was owed. Her sons believed their father had drowned. The case looked, for all the world, like a tragedy. But would a drowned man need a hidden door? Because John Darwin had not drowned at all. He was living in a bedsit in the house next door, a property the couple also owned. And the 2 homes were connected. Behind a wardrobe in the family home, a passage had been cut through into the adjoining building. While his sons grieved and his neighbors offered sympathy, John Darwin was hiding a single wall away from his own funeral notices, slipping back and forth through a gap behind the furniture. The plan, though, could not stay that small forever. The couple began looking beyond England. They set their sights on Panama and started arranging a new life in Central America, where John could eventually exist openly under a future identity. Then, on December 1st, 2007, John Darwin walked into a police station in London. He told officers he believed he was a missing person and claimed he had no memory of the previous several years. His sons were stunned and, at first, overjoyed. Their father had come back from the dead. But the story unraveled almost immediately. Within days, a newspaper published a photograph. It showed John and Anne Darwin together in a property agent's office in Panama, taken in 2006, well after his supposed death. The image had been sitting online. The amnesia story collapsed under the weight of a single picture. And in fact, a police investigation had already quietly begun months earlier, after one of Anne's colleagues overheard a revealing phone call. How do you explain a photograph of a dead man house hunting? Anne Darwin was arrested at Manchester Airport. In July of 2008, at Teesside Crown Court, the case reached its end. John Darwin had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of obtaining property by deception, along with a passport offense, and was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months. Anne received 6 years and 6 months. Their appeals were later dismissed. The courts also pursued the money, issuing a confiscation order for the proceeds of the fraud, much of it eventually recovered through the sale of the Panama property and the family home. John was released from prison in early 2011, and Anne shortly after. They divorced. Anne later wrote a memoir about the years she had spent maintaining the lie. John remarried and moved abroad. The man who staged his own death to escape his debts had, in the end, lost the marriage, the money, and the freedom he had gambled everything to protect. John Darwin chose to disappear. The next man had the choice made for him by history itself. Ishinosuke Uwano. A young soldier was sent to a remote island in the final years of the Second World War. His family in Japan waited for decades. They eventually gave up and recorded him among the war dead. Then, more than 60 years later, a letter arrived. Ishinosuke Uwano was born in October of 1922 in Iwate Prefecture, in the north of Japan. He was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943 and posted to the southern half of Sakhalin Island, a stretch of territory that Japan controlled at the time. He was, in those years, simply one more young man sent far from home into a war that was tightening around his country. In August of 1945, the Soviet Union invaded Sakhalin. Uwano was among roughly 14,000 Japanese troops captured in the operation. The war ended, but for him, there was no journey home. He remained in Soviet-held territory. According to Japanese government records, the last contact he had with his family came in 1958, while he was still on Sakhalin. After that, silence. Imagine writing letter after letter to a son and receiving nothing back for a lifetime. What happened next was not a story of imprisonment or escape. It was, in its way, far quieter. Uwano did not come home because, over time, he built a life where he was. He relocated to Ukraine in the mid-1960s. He married a Ukrainian woman. He settled in the city of Zhytomyr, west of Kiev, and raised 3 children. The soldier from Iwate became a husband and a father thousands of miles from the country that had sent him to war, living in a language and a world entirely separate from the one he was born into. His family in Japan had no way of knowing any of this. The letters had stopped decades earlier. And so, in the year 2000, after a lifetime of silence, his relatives in Iwate gave their consent for him to be officially recorded as having died in the war. His name was entered onto Japan's rolls of the war dead. The chapter, as far as anyone in Japan believed, was finally closed. But Uwano was not finished with his old life. In late 2005 and into 2006, he asked an acquaintance on Sakhalin to help him find his Japanese relatives. The request worked its way through official channels. He was interviewed at the Japanese embassy in Kyiv. And in April of 2006, the story broke. A Japanese soldier, recorded as dead, was alive and well in Ukraine, 83 years old, with a family of his own. What do you say to a brother you last saw before a world war? On April 19, 2006, Uwano boarded a flight from Ukraine to Tokyo, accompanied by one of his sons. He traveled on a Ukrainian passport. He was, by then, a Ukrainian citizen who no longer spoke the language of his birth. When he met his 80-year-old brother in Iwate, the two men, separated for 63 years, wept and patted each other on the back. Uwano spoke to his family through the languages of his adopted home. He greeted them carefully, telling them that he had not spoken Japanese for 60 years, and that first of all, he wanted to say, "Konnichiwa." He visited the graves of his parents. He saw the cherry blossoms, but he made it clear he had no intention of staying. His home, his wife, his children, and his life were in Ukraine now. There were no charges, no controversy, only a government quietly beginning the process of restoring his official records. Japanese authorities believed at the time that hundreds of former soldiers from the war might still be living across the former Soviet Union. Uwano returned to Ukraine. He died there in 2013 at the age of 90, a Japanese soldier who had outlived his own death notice by more than a decade. Uwano's lost years were the result of war and distance. The next man lost his because his own mind closed a door behind him. Gabriel Nagy. A husband called home to say he was coming for lunch. He left work and never arrived. For 23 years, his family searched, and a court was about to declare him dead, when a single Medicare card changed everything. Gabriel Nagy lived in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, Australia, with his wife Pamela and their children. He was a husband and a father, with an ordinary routine and an ordinary life. On January 21st, 1987, that life ended without warning. Nagy telephoned Pamela in the middle of the day to tell her he was coming home for lunch. He left his workplace. He simply never made it to the table. The next day, his car was found in an inner Sydney suburb, burned out. It was an alarming clue, the kind that points investigators toward the worst possible conclusions. To his family, the empty, scorched vehicle felt like proof that something terrible had happened on the short drive home. But then the trail did something strange. 2 weeks after he vanished, Gabriel Nagy withdrew money from his bank account, not in Sydney, but in Newcastle, a city well to the north. He used the money to buy camping supplies. It was not the behavior of a man in danger. It looked instead like the behavior of a man quietly preparing to keep moving. And after that purchase, the trail went completely cold. So was this a man who was taken, or a man who walked away? For years, that question had no answer. What investigators would eventually come to believe was that Gabriel Nagy had suffered a severe head injury around the time he disappeared. Nagy himself, much later, would recall bleeding heavily from a wound to his head, and he carried a scar at the back of it. The working explanation was a dissociative fugue, a condition in which a person loses their sense of identity and memory and can travel far from home with no recollection of who they are or where they came from. While his family in Sydney lived through more than 2 decades of not knowing, Gabriel Nagy was alive in the state of Queensland. He had been living under a different name. He worked on fishing boats and on construction sites, drifting through a life that had no connection to the one he had left behind. Late in that period, he had been taken in by a local pastor in the city of Mackay. He was not hiding exactly. He simply did not know there was anything to hide from. 23 years is a long time to hold on to hope. The Nagy family had nearly run out of it. A coronial inquest had been scheduled, the formal process that would end with Gabriel Nagy being declared legally dead. According to reporting, that inquest was only about 2 weeks away. Could a single document really undo 23 years of silence? It could. A police officer had reopened the cold case, and she carried out one last check of public records. She searched databases that a missing man, living quietly under another name, might still touch without realizing it, and she found one. A recently issued Medicare card, Australia's public health record, in Gabriel Nagy's real name, registered in Mackay, Queensland. The officer flew to Mackay. She found Gabriel Nagy and sat down with him, and she showed him photographs and letters from the family he could not remember. Nagy later described the moment his old life came rushing back. He said it was like a cartoon where flashbulbs go off above people's heads. That same afternoon, he sat down and wrote a long letter to his family, several pages of it. 3 days later, his wife Pamela called him. Nagy recalled the conversation simply. They talked until the battery died. There were no charges and no crime. Gabriel Nagy chose, even after the reunion, to live separately from his family. But he kept in contact with them by phone. After 23 years lost inside his own mind, he had at least found the way back to their voices. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Gabriel Nagy's lost years ended at a reunion. The next man's lost years would end the moment he was found and then begin all over again. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. A trained doctor walked out of his home in Spain and was not seen again. 2 decades later, mushroom pickers in an Italian forest stumbled onto a bearded stranger living under a tarp. He gave them a name that had been declared dead. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar was born in Bilbao, in northern Spain, and trained as a medical doctor. By the middle of the 1990s, he had built the kind of life that should have anchored a person. He had an education, a profession, and a family who loved him. But he was also living with severe depression, a weight that does not show up on any record and does not respond to a steady address or a respectable career. In 1996, Carlos vanished from his home in the Seville region. There was no dramatic scene, no abandoned car, no final phone call. He was simply gone. His family began a search that would stretch on for years, following whatever thin leads they could find and turning up nothing. The trail was not cold so much as non-existent. How does a man with a medical degree disappear so completely that even his own parents cannot find a single thread? For 14 years, Spanish authorities waited. That long delay was not neglect. It reflected the standard procedure in Spain for a prolonged disappearance, a process that requires years to pass before the law will accept the worst. Finally, in 2010, the courts declared Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar legally dead. His family had no body, no grave, and no answers. They had only a piece of paper that told them to stop hoping. But Carlos was not dead. He was hundreds of miles away, in a forest in Tuscany, and he had been there almost the entire time. The discovery came in the autumn of 2015. 2 people foraging for mushrooms near the town of Scarlino in central Italy noticed something out of place. A trail of plastic bottles led off the footpath into the trees. They followed it, and at the end of it, they found an encampment and a heavily bearded man living beneath a tarp. Startled, they fled. But they came back, this time with a forest ranger. The man did not run. He spoke to them. He told them plainly that he was Spanish. His name was Carlos, and he had been living there since 1997. He said he did not want to live among people, and that now that they had found him, he needed to get away. Then he produced something extraordinary, a battered, expired Spanish passport, bearing the name Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. The foragers photographed the passport on a phone. They alerted a missing persons association in Italy, which in turn contacted its counterpart in Spain. The impossible news traveled back to the family of a man the state had buried on paper 5 years earlier. His parents flew to Italy. When his mother saw the photograph of the passport, the recognition was instant. She said that was him, that was their Carlos, that he was alive, and that this was the most important thing. Imagine being told your son is alive, and then being told you have only hours to reach him. Because by the time his parents and a search party reached the campsite, Carlos was already gone again. He had left behind water canisters and a tarp, and nothing else. The man who had been declared dead, found, and identified, had simply melted back into the forest before the people who loved him could close the distance. His mother told reporters that the family respected his will and his freedom, but that they were not leaving until they had held him in their arms again, even if it was only one last time. A coordinator with the Spanish Missing Persons Group put the situation in stark terms, explaining that by the time Carlos's parents arrived in Italy, he had disappeared again, that the search remained active, and that Carlos remained officially dead. That is where the case still rests. No reputable outlet has confirmed a sighting, a return, or a death since November of 2015. In the Spanish civil registry, Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar is still listed as a dead man. even though the world knows he walked out of that forest alive. Carlos chose the silence of the trees. The next man chose a stage, a microphone, and a brand new name. Lawrence Joseph Bader. A cookware salesman rented a small boat on Lake Erie and rowed out into a coming storm. He never came back to shore. 8 years later, a niece walked up to a television personality in Chicago and asked if he was her missing uncle. Lawrence Joseph Bader, known to most people as Larry, lived in Akron, Ohio. He was the son of a dentist, had served in the Navy, and worked as a cookware salesman. By 1957, he and his wife Mary Lou had 3 children, with a 4th on the way. He was an enthusiastic archer. He was also quietly in serious trouble. He had not filed tax returns for years, and he was deep in debt, an enormous sum for a salesman supporting a growing family. On May 15, 1957, Bader told his pregnant wife he was driving to Cleveland on business. When she asked him to come straight home, he gave her an answer that would haunt the case. He said, "Maybe I will, and maybe I won't." He cashed a check, paid some bills, and then rented a 14-foot motorboat on the water near Cleveland. The man who rented it to him warned him more than once that a storm was coming in. Bader took a suitcase aboard and went out anyway. Why would a man carry a suitcase onto a small boat for an evening on the lake? The next morning, his damaged boat was found on a beach with an oar missing. Bader was gone. The Coast Guard concluded that no one could have survived the conditions out on the water that night. In 1960, an Ohio court formally declared Lawrence Bader dead. His wife received the life insurance money and was granted monthly survivor's benefits. A husband and father had drowned in a storm, and his family was left to grieve and rebuild. But Lawrence Bader had not drowned. Within days of vanishing from Ohio, a man calling himself John Fritz Johnson appeared in Omaha, Nebraska. He introduced himself as a recently discharged Navy veteran with years of service behind him. And this new man was anything but quiet. He sat on a flagpole for 30 days to raise money for charity, a public spectacle that put his face in front of the city. He became a radio disc jockey and then a sports director at an Omaha television station. He drove a converted hearse fitted out as a hunting vehicle. He married a young woman, adopted her daughter, and had a son with her. John Fritz Johnson was a local personality, a familiar face, a man who lived out loud in front of an entire city that had no idea he was supposed to be at the bottom of Lake Erie. How can a man build a public life under a name that was never his? In 1964, a tumor cost Johnson his left eye, and he began wearing an eye patch. Then, on February 2nd, 1965, he was demonstrating archery at a sporting goods show in Chicago. In the crowd was someone from Akron who recognized him. That person summoned Bader's niece, who walked up to the television personality and asked him directly whether he was her uncle, Larry Bader, the man who had disappeared years earlier. Bader's brothers flew to Chicago. The FBI compared fingerprints from John Fritz Johnson against Lawrence Bader's Navy enlistment records. They matched. The cookware salesman from Ohio and the television personality from Omaha were the same man. What followed was not a fraud trial. A team of psychiatrists examined him for 10 days and concluded that he genuinely had no memory of being Lawrence Bader, a condition possibly worsened by the tumor that had taken his eye. Charges could not be sustained. But the rest of his life collapsed around the revelation. His second marriage was annulled. His first wife refused to divorce him, and now faced the prospect of repaying the insurance money she had received. He lost his television job and went back to bartending, splitting his small wages between 2 families. Even the man who had rented him the boat reportedly wanted to be paid back, saying Bader still owed him a boat. The case did not have years left to resolve itself. Bader's eye cancer spread, and on September 16, 1966, the man who had lived as two people died as one, at just 39 years old. Lawrence Bader may never have known he was running. The next woman knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it for 31 years. Petra Padzitka. A young university student left her residence to attend an appointment and celebrate a family birthday. She never arrived. Years later, a man confessed to her murder, and she was declared dead. She had been alive the entire time. Petra Padzitka was a computer science student at the Technical University in Braunschweig, in the German state of Lower Saxony. She was, by every outward measure, an ordinary young woman with an ordinary future taking shape in front of her. On July 26, 1984, she left her student residence with two plans for the day: a dentist appointment and an evening at her family home to celebrate her brother's birthday. She did neither. She never reached the dentist, and she never reached the family table. Investigators traced her movements as far as a bus stop, and there the trail simply stopped. There were details that hinted at intention rather than misfortune. Before she vanished, Petra had withdrawn savings from her account, and she had asked a neighbor to look after her pet bird. The case drew national attention, becoming the subject of an episode of a well-known German crime program. Were those quiet preparations the sign of a victim, or of someone planning to leave? At the time, no one read them that way. In 1987, a young man who had been arrested for a serious crime against a girl from the same region confessed that he had also killed Petra Padzitka. No body was ever found. He would later retract the confession. But it was enough. On the strength of that initial confession, Petra was officially declared dead in 1989, and the cold case was administratively closed. Her family believed she had been murdered. They grieved a daughter and a sister who, in their minds, had been taken violently from them. For 31 years, that was the accepted truth. Then, in September of 2015, police in the city of Dusseldorf were called to a reported burglary at an apartment. The woman who lived there identified herself as Frau Schneider. When officers asked her for identification, she could not produce any documents. They pressed further, and under that pressure, the woman admitted who she really was. She was Petra Padzitka. She still had her decades-old, expired West German identity card, and she handed it over. One of the officers involved had, as a young policeman, postponed a holiday to join the original search for her in 1984. More than 3 decades later, he was the one able to tell her elderly mother that the daughter she had buried in her heart was alive. The identification was helped by a strange bureaucratic accident. Although her file should have been closed when she was declared dead, Petra's missing person record had never been removed from the police system. How does a person live for 31 years without ever being seen? Petra explained it to police herself. She had saved money for months before she disappeared, and she had secretly rented an apartment in advance, putting the pieces of her escape in place while everyone around her saw only a busy student. Over the following 3 decades, she had lived in several German cities, most recently spending 11 years in Dusseldorf under the surname Schneider. She held no bank account, no social security number, no driving license, and no passport. She paid for everything in cash. She worked jobs that left no official trace. She had built an entire life designed to be invisible, a life with no paper edges for anyone to catch. And it had worked completely for 31 years. Prosecutors declared Petra Patsitka officially alive and announced that she would not face any charges. She had committed no crime by leaving, but she gave investigators nothing to explain why. She would not name a reason, a grievance, or a fear. A police spokesman said that, as to the motive of her disappearance, she gave no explanation and expressly said that she continued to want no contact with the public or her family. Her father had died during the years she was gone. Petra agreed only to accept a letter from her mother and brother, and nothing more. She has never publicly resurfaced again. The young woman the world believed had been murdered chose instead to remain a stranger to everyone who had ever mourned her. Petra Patsitka vanished by careful design. The next man insists he simply woke up, hundreds of miles from where he was lost. Stephen Kubacki. A college senior set out on a solo skiing trip along a frozen lake and disappeared. His footprints ended at the water's edge. 15 months later, he woke up in a field hundreds of miles away, wearing clothes he did not recognize. Stephen Kubacki was a senior at a small college in Holland, Michigan. He was studying history, had spent time abroad in Europe, and was only a handful of credits short of his degree. People who knew him described him as a little more free-spirited than the average student. He was also an experienced cross-country skier, comfortable in cold and difficult terrain. On February 20th, 1978, Kubacki set off alone on a cross-country skiing trip near Saugatuck, on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. He did not return. The next day, snowmobilers found his skis, his poles, and his backpack abandoned near the shoreline. A trail of his footprints, about 200 yards long, led across the snow and then ended abruptly at the edge of the lake. If his footprints stopped at the water, where could the rest of him possibly be? To the searchers, the scene told a grim and simple story. Air and land searches concluded that Stephen Kubacki had fallen through the ice and drowned. No body was recovered. His parents refused to accept it quietly and hired a private investigator. For a time, the case was even considered alongside the unidentified victims of a notorious criminal, and Kubacki's dental records were sent away for comparison. That spring, his college awarded him his degree in absentia. As far as the world was concerned, a promising young man had died on the ice. But Stephen Kubacki was never formally declared dead by a court, and that detail would turn out to matter. On May 5, 1979, 15 months after he vanished, Kubacki woke up lying in a grassy field. He was not in Michigan. He was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, roughly 700 miles to the east. He was wearing clothes he did not recognize. He had about $40 in cash, a new pair of glasses, and a marathon t-shirt from a race he had no memory of running. His backpack held maps and hand-lettered hitchhiking signs, the kind that suggested travel through Sacramento, San Francisco, Reno, Chicago, and Utah. His last memory was of being cold and lost on the ice in Michigan. Everything between that moment and the field in Massachusetts was gone. 15 months erased as cleanly as if they had never happened. What happens to a person during 15 months they cannot remember? That is the question the case has never answered. Kubacki returned to his life. He told reporters at the time, with a kind of weary honesty, that he felt like he had done a lot of running. He declined a psychiatric examination. He believed his blackout had been caused by exhaustion and exposure, and said he would see only a medical doctor about it. There were no charges and no legal fallout. There was simply a young man who had returned from the dead with a hole in his life where more than a year should have been. Kubacki went on to finish his degree and to build a serious career. He earned a doctorate and became a practicing psychologist in the Pacific Northwest, a profession built entirely on understanding the human mind. For decades, he turned away most questions about what had happened to him, and the missing 15 months stayed sealed. But the story did not stay completely closed. In recent years, Kubaki began promoting a self-published memoir and a personal website that describes him as one of history's last unexplained missing persons. The site hints at a life lived in shadows, a phrase that could mean almost anything. It could be a clue that there was always more to the story than exhaustion and a blackout on the ice. Or it could simply be the careful language of a man selling a book about his own mystery. No medical or police report from 1979 has ever been made public. Whatever truly happened across those 15 months, Stephen Kubaki has kept it to himself. And the world is left with only the footprints that ended at the water and the field where he woke up alive. Stephen Kubaki cannot say where he went. The next man knew exactly where he went, because he had planned his own death down to the obituary. Francisco Paesa. A Spanish spy and arms dealer with a lifetime of scandals announced his own death by heart attack in Bangkok. Obituaries ran. Masses were said for his soul. 6 years later, photographs proved he had been alive the whole time. Francisco Paesa Sanchez was born in Madrid in 1936. He was not an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, and his disappearance was not the product of illness, war, or a lost memory. Paesa was a freelance intelligence operative tied to Spain's intelligence service, and a businessman who collected an extraordinary catalog of scandals across 4 decades. He had dealings with foreign dictators. He had been arrested by Interpol and jailed abroad. He moved through the worlds of espionage and money in a way that left a long trail of enemies. In the 1980s, posing as an arms dealer, Paesa sold a separatist group 2 missiles fitted with tracking devices, a sting that led authorities straight to a major weapons cache. He was later named, by a foreign government, as a diplomatic representative, a title that briefly handed him diplomatic immunity. And in the mid-1990s, he became central to one of Spain's most notorious financial cases, helping a disgraced senior official flee the country with a fortune in embezzled funds, then reportedly arranging that official's arrest while keeping much of the money for himself. How does a man with that many enemies simply step off the board? He died, or so the world was told. In 1998, news emerged that Francisco Paesa had suffered a fatal heart attack in Thailand. Obituaries appeared in the Spanish press. His family obtained a death certificate, lodged it with a Spanish court, and arranged for a series of religious masses to be said for his soul. The man with a lifetime of scandals had, conveniently, escaped all of them at once. He was beyond the reach of every court, every creditor, and every enemy he had ever made. But Spanish authorities and Spanish journalists never believed a word of it. Their suspicion was correct. In November of 2004, a Spanish newspaper published photographs of Francisco Paesa alive in Europe. He had been living between Luxembourg and southern France under a new name, carrying a foreign passport, and even claiming to be more than a decade younger than his true age. The dead spy had not been dead at all. He had spent 6 years quietly existing as another man while the world believed he was in a grave. What does a man say when he is caught having faked his own death? When journalists eventually reached him, Paesa was almost casual about it. Asked how being thought dead had helped him, he gave an answer that captured the whole strange affair. He said it was not that it helped him, that he simply did not care. Years later, he offered a different and far more dramatic version of events, claiming his 1998 death had been a misunderstanding after he was shot during a mission for a foreign government and spent months in a coma. That account came only from Paesa himself and its strained belief. There were, in the end, no criminal consequences. No conviction was ever obtained against him in Spain. The financial case tied to the embezzled fortune was archived once its time limit expired, the law running out of road before it could catch him. Paesa spent the rest of his life largely in Paris, living under assumed names, a man who had successfully erased himself once and faced no real penalty for it. He had treated his own death as just another operation, and it had worked as well as anything else he had ever arranged. And then, in 2023, Francisco Paesa died again. According to Spanish reporting, he passed away in May of that year in the northern suburbs of Paris at the age of 87. But even this ending carries a shadow. The French death certificate was signed by his daughter, who worked as a nurse. For a man who had once staged his own death so convincingly that masses were said over an empty grave, a second death certified by a family member was always going to invite doubt. Some Spanish journalists openly wondered whether the master of disappearance had performed one final act. No independent confirmation has ever resolved it. Francisco Paesa, the spy who died twice, remains exactly what he spent his life becoming, a man no one could ever be sure was truly gone. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.